Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're certainly have a quorum, and I appreciate it. I know there's other committee meetings going on in conflict with this one. So we left off yesterday with 3 or 4 questions on the board, which I'd like to get back to after I give Senator Rogers an opportunity to explain. I think there were some minor technical corrections made overnight. We're working now from LC 189240TS. Is that what everybody has in front of them? Senator Rogers, you're recognized. Please, sir, to bring us up to date on where we are, and then I'll open this back up for questions and maybe a vote soon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I may request some assistance from Lindsay on this as well. I know one change on the bottom of page 3. It was brought to our attention that we wanted to be very clear about which options that a taxpayer had, and that they didn't have all the options, but they had some. They could choose from these options, and I think we clarified that. That would be lines 95 through 97. There was another question yesterday about that we dwelled on for quite some time about the issue of future use, and I'm trying to find.
It's on page 12, as I remember.
Page
26.
If you look on line 876, it has been changed to say, and in no event shall future use be the sole consideration. I will leave it up to the wisdom of this committee. I actually kind of prefer the previous version where it just said that we could not use future use as consideration. I don't know that there's a constitutional problem with that, and we have a couple of tax attorneys here who would be willing to speak to that, but I will leave it up to the wisdom of the committee if they'd like to go with this route.
Ms. Abrams, you do this. What do you think? What are your thoughts?
At the risk of opining without actually being an expert, I actually prefer the changed language. I do think Mr. Schroyer is correct that the combination of changing from consider to apply, which makes it an obligatory consideration, I do think there's some unintended consequences if you say that no future use shall be, that you have to apply, that you cannot apply future use at all. I think that this language should adequately address the concern that he has, because I do think the language by itself, if we kept shall consider, I don't think the language would be problematic, and I think if you had apply, but with this language, you also have the right combination. So I think Joe's right.
Mr. Schroyer?
Mr. Chairman, in looking at this now, if we're going to go with this language, I wonder if we ought to, on line 877, change the word consideration to criteria applied, because up on line 871 we changed consider to apply.
Right.
So it's talking about applying the following criteria. So is the use of consideration correct on line 877? It seems like it ought to be criteria applied.
Yeah, pure wordsmithing. I think you're absolutely right there. So yeah, and it's consistent with the other, but I'm not convinced still, and I'm sure now it's just because of my inability to understand, which some people call ignorance, why we need to make the change. And I'm serious about that. Do you have another legal opinion with you?
Yes, sir. If I could ask Mr. Wheeler Bryan to join us. He's a property tax attorney.
Mr. Bryan, could you keep it reasonably short and let us know why you maybe think differently than you've heard here today?
May I just stand here?
Yes, sir.
We have an old case in Georgia that said when this section VI was any other factors deemed perfect. Existing was put in by Senate Bill 55 last year to coincide with existing zoning, existing use, existing covenants, and existing other factors. To try to clarify that Georgia is not a highest and best use state, but an existing state for property tax purposes. You put this shall shall not be the sole situation. I think you're going back to the old case that says they can consider highest and best use, and I think it's very damaging to property taxpayers.
Thank you. So 27, and then I would like to hear Representative Abrams' rebuttal. Who's 27? Is that Representative Powell?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had some concerns as well about the just saying that no future use be the consideration. But I think Sol goes way too far in swinging the pendulum the other way, because if you look at the statute, it says the tax assessor shall apply the following criteria: existing zoning, existing use, existing covenants, and there'd be no circumstance would future use be the sole criteria, because of the fact that everything else has to be applied. And so by its very nature, it would never be the sole criteria. I mean, it needs to be either go back to what it was, or it needs to be primary or substantial or something that's other than sole.
It's mutually exclusive, is what you're saying.
Right.
You couldn't restate it as sole when you've got everything around it as to be applied. I think that's a good point. Representative Chairman Knight.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I apologize, I'm not one of the attorneys that are opining here, but
It's generally not something you need to apologize for.
But a question going back to, and maybe this is a question for either the majority leader or the learned attorney out there, but we're going back to trying to do fair market value, and the statement is from an existing or a best use, and that we have here, to a state that is not, is existing use. But when we go back to looking at fair market value of property, and we go to appraise fair market value of property, isn't that sort of contradictory? I mean, if I'm a seller and I want to sell my property, I'm going to sell it at the highest and best use that's out there. So if we're talking about fair market value of property, I'm, as a seller, not going to sell my property for anything less than its highest and best use. So isn't this sort of contradictory? I guess that's, from a principal point of view, could you explain?
I would just, as a person who's bought and sold many properties, I would just say that I'm going to sell it at the best price I can get for it, regardless of what I think it's worth. It's what the person buying it thinks it's worth, and what they want to use it for is really of no relevance to me. So maybe I just look at it differently, but highest and best use doesn't come into play when I'm trying to sell a property. It's what will somebody pay me for. But I would let the attorney answer that if you'd like.
Yeah.
We value property at fair market value under its existing use. If somebody buys a vacant lot and puts a high-rise building on it, the use changes and the value can change, but you don't value the parking lot as if it had a high-rise building on it before the high-rise building is put there.
But, Mr. Chairman, if I may give an example back that may you can explain by this example. If I've got what traditionally has been maybe agriculture or farmland that is sitting next to the newest development that's sitting on the highway, and these do occur. I mean, it's occurred all the way up in my district to South Georgia, okay? And so now all of a sudden you've got the latest discount mall that's sitting out there, okay? And all of a sudden that property is worth, $100,000 an acre, but I'm sitting over there with the adjacent 10 acres of land, and from a farm use point of view, it's worth $1,000. Do you think I'm going to sell that land at $1,000 an acre? And I'm certainly the majority leader. If you were in that case, you wouldn't. If
it doesn't matter what you're going to sell it.
How's that relevant?
But if it's fair market,
We're talking
value,
about establishing a value for the property in any given one time. So what does it matter what you're going to sell it for? What gets developed around it?
That's the Sibley case that you're talking about. The farm that was in Cobb County that is established that you can't value it because of having a shopping center next
Representative Abrams, after hearing that, I'm not trying to take advantage of your great body of knowledge. I know you're here as a representative of the people and not as an esteemed tax lawyer and expert, but it seems to me that what we're distinguishing here truly is existing use, sort of like a balance sheet as opposed to a P&L. That the existing use in one moment in time as it is determined by a system that we're trying to have fairly and equitably applied to every citizen and every property owner in Georgia, as opposed to a value that is futuristic in a sense. Could you speak to that as it relates to what you think the status of the law is, as well as what you think it ought to be?
My approach is always, I kind of approach this from the time when I was a city attorney. What's the interpretation of the law and the plain facts without having the benefit of this conversation? And I think my concern mirrors what Mr. Schorier said yesterday. We're making this obligatory. So we are obliging tax assessors to follow certain procedures and to consider certain factors. It is no longer permissive to take some things into consideration and ignore other things. My concern is that absent language, that the absolute language in no event shall future use be considered is such a blanket conversation and such a blanket determination that reasonable people could disagree about whether a tax assessor's thought process actually included some notion of future use. I actually was going to suggest what Mr. Powell recommended, which is that I understand what the majority leader wants to achieve. I actually don't necessarily have a policy bent about this either way. This wasn't anything I wanted to talk about. But that said, I think as a matter of law, if we're going to say that it must be applied, I think we need to include limiting language in there that says that in no event shall future use be the primary criteria, so that we preserve the fact that there may be something we are not considering. And we don't want to create something that abrogates the entire section, because we were saying to a tax assessor, you must apply these criteria, and you can't use anything else. And if for some reason they use something else, you could unsettle an entire assessment scheme that simply because we couldn't think of what constituted some future use provision. Because future use is a fairly broad and vague term. And what if we're talking about an appraisal that's happening during a pending zoning decision, and we know the appraisal, we know that this is going to happen. I think there are a number of scenarios you could spin out that makes an absolute statement, in no event shall future use be considered, and it's an absolute. I think that's dangerous for us to do in this bill. No, we're talking about whether to go back to the earlier language. So I actually think this language, it sort of splits the baby nicely. But I do think you add the primary, and I think you add criteria, because I think you're just saying you can't use this and you have to use all these other things. But I think it's dangerous to say in no event shall future use be considered, which was the earlier language.
Does the minority leader and his counsel on this issue believe that the current law, majority leader, I'm sorry.
we got elections in November, but that's not here yet.
My sincere apology. Believe that the current status of the law, but we obviously believe that the current status of the law is that future use is taken into account for valuation purposes, or we wouldn't have felt a need to put this in new law to change that. Is that a fair assumption? Am I?
Mr. Chairman, I would agree that we believe future use is being applied, and that it was my intent not to have it being applied, not to have it. I think it was allowed. Now, I mean, I'm going to trust the wisdom of this committee. Whichever direction you want to go is fine. Just the word future to me means speculation, because we have no idea what's going to happen in the future. So when you allow future anything, you're allowing speculation, and I think that was one of the intents of this legislation, was to take as much speculation out of the process as possible.
Are you 12 or 11? I'm sorry. You're on. You're recognized.
I'm not a lawyer, all last night, but we're related to what Representative Abrams said. If we stick with, as the chairman suggested, no event shall be considered, she makes a statement you can't prove they aren't. You can't ever prove state of mind in a courtroom. I think that's one of the issues. But outside their mind, and, if they have that in mind or not, it's just stagnant. That you do not look at what could be there in the future, you only look at what is there today. Isn't that what we're trying to get at? That we give them guidance and we don't intend you to look at future use with it. Can't get in your mind and prove you're not, but isn't that what we're trying to do for you?
The intent, my intent was certainly to remove as much speculation from the process as possible, and I felt from the beginning that prohibiting future use or speculation about what something may be worth in the future would help in that case.
Number 2, who's that?
That was because I couldn't line up before.
Oh, okay. Number 19, David.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Here's the part that I'm confused about, because we keep going back to we want fair market value, right? And on line 855, it defines fair market value of property means the amount a knowledgeable buyer would pay for the property and a willing seller would accept for the property at an arm's length bona fide sale, right?
Correct.
So let's go back to my example here of the farmer that's sitting out there with 20 acres next to a developed shopping mall, okay? How does that relate back to fair market value of land? In other words, let's do it another way. If that farmer went out there and wanted to borrow money on that land, and he went to go get an appraisal on that land, how do you think he would want that appraisal, the fair market value of the appraisal of that land, to come out? If it came back at $2,000 an acre based on existing use, would he be able to go to the bank and borrow money on it?
Well,
or would he? It's a double-edged sword. I'm just trying to say what is consistent here. I mean,
right now,
to
he
both
probably wouldn't be able to borrow money on it.
The process is elastic. If the comparables in the area, the prices have gone up vis-a-vis the shopping center purchaser paid the farmer $15,000 an acre for that location, then there's going to be an effect in the subsequent valuation years on that farmland, maybe even before a rezoning takes place. I mean, the system already contemplates your example.
Can I give you a real-world example? And this is, I'm not going to give you names here, but I have a relative who owns some property in North Fulton County. In fact, I think it's in Representative Martin's district. Yeah, he lived, and Representative Martin knows this gentleman. He lives on a few hundred acres in North Fulton, and you know what that means. And he was standing, and this is an honest story, because it happened 2 weeks ago. He was standing in his front yard, and a gentleman from New York pulled up and said, "I'll give you $25 million for your property." He said no. He came back the next week and said, "I'll give you $35 million for your property." He said no. He said, "This is my house. I was born in that house. I'll die in that house. I'm never selling this property." Now, of course, he'd already sold 2,000 acres next to it, so he had all the money he ever needed. But it doesn't mean that the assessor should come up and say, because a guy from New York is willing to pay you $35 million, your property is worth $35 million, because it's a farm, and it ought to be valued at that.
Well, I agree with that, but there's also situations that we've got currently out there. Have you advised a constituent to put his land in Cuba?
He may have it in Cuba. He probably doesn't need to have it in Cuba, but it's up to him.
I don't want to get into that, too. Chairman Houston. Oh, okay. Chairman Peake. You too. Oh, you are?
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to say, I don't think that the property owner should be penalized for a what-if type scenario. That's my concern. I think this is an effort to protect someone who wants to continue the family farm or something like that. I applaud your efforts. I certainly don't think that you should be penalized because you want to continue to farm the property that you've had in your family forever. So that's the only comment that I have, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I would offer a suggestion. If we just struck the new language on lines 876 and 877 altogether, just the new language.
You mean beginning with and ending with consideration?
Yes. Why would you want to take that out?
Well, If we do that, then it says the tax assessor shall apply the existing zoning of property, the existing use of property, the existing covenants or restrictions, and we wouldn't even be dealing with future use at all.
I think that might be the best compromise.
Okay,
Then you don't have the counter implication of it.
exactly.
We'll maybe consider that as an amendment when we get there.
Thank you.
Go ahead. I'm sorry we got bogged down on that. Is there any other questions on that? We got one more quick. Chairman Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Based on what the leader said, we're trying to get rid of future use somehow or another. Does it need to be even considered? I mean, there's ways to do it, say that future use should not be considered just as without any mandates on it, or just leave it out altogether. Is that what we're trying to do?
I would suggest we leave it out altogether.
I agree.
That's probably less consideration, frankly, than stating it shouldn't be considered.
Correct.
27. Yeah, quickly, please.
Very quickly. Mr. Chairman and Mr. Leader, I do have a question based on what Representative Knight said as to whether there is an inconsistency between our definition of fair market value that says what a willing buyer will pay a willing seller and then the criteria that we're saying are to be used in determining that. I think we do have an inconsistency, and I just raised that as an issue. I don't have a solution.
My solution is to get rid of the property tax altogether, and we'll be done with this. But I agree with you. We are taking a system that is so broken and trying to apply as many Band-Aids as we can. And I think the result will be much better, but we're never going to solve some of these problems when you inject human beings into a situation of determining what somebody else's property is worth. You're always going to have problems.
We see that. Were there any other changes you wanted to explain? Representative Abrams.
Just to respond to Representative Powell's concern, I think that and to Representative Knight's concern, I think that's actually taken care of through on line 884, which permits any other existing factor. So the fact that we've included all of these other fair market value requirements, I think if you eliminate the language on 876 and 877, but preserve the language on 884 and 885, anything that we've required in the statute can be used as a factor, including the arm's length transaction and the bona fide negotiation. So I do think you actually solve the problem that you're raising.
Wow. Need to get you two working together more often. Can you continue, Senator?
Mr. Chairman, I believe that's it.
That was okay. Now, ladies and gentlemen, when we left off yesterday, I'd asked you to present any amendments or proposed amendments to the author. I think we had 3 questions on the board, and I remember one of those was Representative Abrams. Do you recall what it was? And would you yield for a few questions?
Absolutely.
Continuing the partnership with Representative Powell, I think he actually addressed the issues that I had. It was simply the language about non-homestead properties and the fact that in that notice language we need to clarify that only one property qualifies so that people don't mistakenly believe they can aggregate their properties. But I think Representative Powell is going to discuss it in detail with his amendment.
And I've spoken with Representative Powell and fully support his amendment. But
okay, can you get the rest of us up to date on that?
On page, I think it's back on page 4, line 96. There was a conversation yesterday about non-homestead properties with a fair market value in excess of $1 million. The way the notice that would go to citizens would read, it would create the presumption that they could aggregate their properties. So if they had properties in aggregate of $1 million, they could use this mechanism. And what we're actually saying is that for any non-homestead property with a fair market value of $1 million, it only applies per parcel, not for your aggregated properties. And so we need to clarify that so that we can eliminate any confusion for taxpayers.
I think that manifests your original intent, but obviously the goal to get this number down over time to where
Correct.
we can get more face-to-face review of these in the future, which is good for everybody. Chairman Martin, I think, right? You use the light on.
Mr. Chairman, I know this Tom would explain that amendment that was in our packet that I've also talked to the leader about. It was offered at the appropriate
Oh, please go with your explanation. You're talking about AM 181596. Is that correct, sir? Okay.
What I would seek to do is add another section, 5-4 to the bill, basically to articulate further in statute what already exists in the Constitution, to make it clear that in determining fair market value of real property, the assessor shall not include intangible assets. We gave the list off to ACCG, the Office of Bill, Legislative Council, of items that should not be included. Already in Article 7, Article 7, paragraph 3, subparagraph B, it says only tangible property should be taxed, and we just wanted to add that section into the bill so that we go in statute and make that clear. In talking with you, Mr. Chairman, at the appropriate time, I would like to strike on line 10 out of the abundance of caution, the government issued license and regulatory restrictions from that amendment. But I have talked to the senator about it, and it's favorable consideration. Again, we want to make sure that these intangibles, which are not to be taxed in bill, are not included in obtaining the fair market value for real property.
Okay. Why don't we deal with that now? Are there any questions from members of the committee about this amendment? Representative Powell?
I guess my question is that based on the criteria to be applied that we've already discussed, which is existing use, existing zoning, those kinds of considerations, why do we need this? In determining fair market value, the tax assessor shall not include. We've already said that the things that they will include are these things, and the implication is that future use is not to be included. I'm wondering if we aren't maybe muddying the water, and I also would ask the author of this if you've talked to some of the representatives of the Department of Revenue as to whether they have any concerns about how this might work. I understand Ms. Lambert's here.
I have only spoken to the gentleman who offered the amendment.
Right. Well, actually, I was directing this to
sorry.
him.
President Powell, I have spoken with the department yesterday, and the reason for putting this in is if you get down, Ms. Lambert actually related to me that in places, in training assessors, they look at a business after when they see this bright, shiny business doing a lot of business, and she has to remind them on occasion if they are to assess the sticks and bricks and property, that it is there, not the ongoing business enterprise. And again, as the Constitution states, it's only supposed to be taxed on tangible property. But you do find at times that assessors they can't split themselves, as Representative Abrams said earlier, state of mind, so we want to make it clear to them that they should not include these sorts of things in as they assess business. We already have business occupation tax in Georgia, we have income tax for corporations and persons in Georgia, they should be taxed on the real property. And I think adding this in to make it clear that they should not include this, and also because of lines 884 and 885 that allow other factors provided by rule or regulation, we want to make sure that somebody doesn't pass a rule somewhere that goes, even though it's in my opinion, in the face of the Constitution, it would be confusing to an assessor that they could somehow include an intangible asset in the value of real property. I think this makes it really clear that we don't want to have that. Just a label on a hotel or a label on an office building shouldn't be used to increase the property value of that, because if a large corporation, that corporation could move in that building, is worth what it is.
Mr. Majority Leader, would you like to speak to that before we ask the...
I would, Representative Martin brings up a good point that 884 and 885, that could allow, by rule and regulation, these type of intangible assets, I guess, to be considered, even though the Constitution says you're only supposed to consider tangible assets. In most law, I don't have a problem by leaving these things silent, but I think in property tax assessment that sometimes you have to be very specific as to what you can consider and can't consider, because There are some counties we have found that take great latitude in considering everything they possibly can that may be in conflict with not only the intent of the law but the letter of the law. So I have no opposition to Representative Martin's amendment.
Is it all right with you if we hear from somebody in the Revenue Department?
Absolutely.
Thank you. While I can't control 159 county boards of tax assessors, I do have a couple of minor things that didn't have a chance to talk to Representative Martin about yesterday. Because of the evaluation of centralized properties or the public utility properties, they're actually done a little bit differently. And some of the things that are listed here as intangibles are actually part of that business valuation that we do there. While this section says the tax assessor shall not consider, I just want to be very careful that we don't end up in federal court litigating disparate treatment between valuations done by the department and valuations done at the local level.
Now, just so the committee will understand, the department has a very small niche of properties, railway lines, and some other things that by law they value at the state level.
Public utilities, airlines, and railroads.
And so I'm hearing from you that you suggest that those issues be exempt from this language.
If I may,
And it may do it by saying tax assessor. I mean, walk over to Representative Martin, but
I wish I had the opportunity to talk further with the DOR, but as I just said, I thought we were in agreement. I guess, well, I understand. I
I had to
didn't
talk to the agency.
well, I question, if the Constitution says we're only supposed to tax tangible property, whether it's a railroad or a utility or an airline, I'll leave that to the constitutional lawyers what we should be doing. All we're trying to do is in statute make clear the intangible assets shouldn't be included. If they feel like they can be included by Constitution now, I don't see that we would get in their way. And when I last talked with Revenue yesterday, they felt like this language was just placing the statute some further references to easy training and echo the Article 7 of the Constitution. So I'm not sure how a statutory change that would replace the constitutional provision in black and white, the statute affects us not having any federal court of disparate treatment. Either it's in the Constitution or it's not.
Good, more confusion. Chairman Knight, is your question about the amendment?
It is, and it's a deeper conversation. I'm just unfamiliar with some of the terms that are in here. The band and flag value, project and asset management. I mean, these are all, I assume, things that are unrelated to real property. But that's my question. If they're unrelated to real property,
If I may, it's the brand and flag value, not band and flag value.
I'm sorry. It says band in the amendment.
It does say ban.
Well, we'll amend the amendment. The brand and flag values is as the gentleman said behind me, a Trump Tower, that type of hotel, as opposed to a different brand, a national brand, being in the same type of building but being taxed differently because of the service that goes along with the hotel. That just happens. It would be, when we talk about the staff or the patient mix, if you have a fully, if you have a business or a nationally renowned position in an office building that somehow, attracts people to want to be in that office building, and you value sticks and bricks of that building more than you would otherwise do that, even though the rents are not high.
Okay, we need to kind of wind this up. We're running low on time. Are there any other questions about the amendment that are not soliloquies? Okay. Are there any questions for the author of the bill? We left yesterday with several. Did you get yours answered? Representative Powell, is your light still? Do you have any? Representative Parsons, did you have any questions about the bill itself? Other members of the committee with any questions? Okay, I don't see any further questions. Would you like to conclude? I would say before we do conclude that this piece of legislation has been well vetted. I can only imagine how many hours the majority leader has in it and his staff to hear. But I will tell you, it is obviously something that has been well nurtured with passion and seen with reasonableness, and the work ethic here is just incredible, and I commend you for that. And thank you for the long journey on behalf of all the people of Georgia. I really do, and your patience that you've shown in dealing with the many consequences of what I believe to be some excellent improvement and reformation. With that said, what is the posture of the committee? I have a motion to do pass. Do I hear a second? Okay, I have a motion and a second, and now discussion. That would be anybody at this point would like to present any amendments. Chair recognizes Representative Martin.
Chairman, in your packet is AM 18-1596. I would like to present that and then ask the committee to accept the technical correction on line 7, ban the created with brand, BRAND, at the end of line 7 is a technical correction. And also, in consultation with Chairman O'Neill, I would like the committee off the amendment to striking, starting on line 10, government issues licenses and regulatory restrictions. I'd like to strike that from the original amendment and offer that as amendment to Senate Bill 347.
Does each member of the committee understand the gentleman's proposal? Any questions about his proposal? Is there objection to the amendment? I have objection. So, does the gentleman move? All in favor of the amendment, please signify by saying aye. Opposed, like sign. I think the ayes clearly have it. The amendment is in. Further discussion regarding LC 18-9240TS. Chairman Martin.
Mr. Chairman, we need to accept the leader's language in line 76, so I would move to amend the original bill by striking on line 876, starting with the comma, and in no event shall future use be sole consideration. I believe that's what the leader is asking in the suggestion.
Yes, sir.
All right. Does everybody understand the gentleman's amendment proposal? Do I hear an objection to that amendment? Hearing none, that's in. Further. Chair recognizes Representative Abrams. Oh, okay. Who yields her recognition to Representative Powell?
Mr. Chairman, to clarify on line 96, 97, I understand from talking to Lindsay that Mr. Sawyer has some language that clarifies that, dealing with, I guess, individual parcels. Is that right, Joe? Yeah. Would you read that?
On page 4, line 96, in between 4, non-homestead, insert a parcel of, and then change the word properties to the singular, property. And I need to make similar revisions on page 11 and page 16. It's the same thing to insert a parcel of.
Could everybody hear Mr. Sawyer in his defense? I know for a fact he worked well past midnight last night and his voice is weak, very deservingly so. Could everybody hear the proposal? Anyone that couldn't hear the proposal? Is that your proposed amendment?
Yes, sir.
What he just stated?
Yes, sir.
Is there objection to the amendment in those three places in the bill? Mr. Leader, is there any objection?
Absolutely not.
Any member of the committee have objection? Hearing none, the amendment's in all three of the places that our legal counsel just stated. And was posed by Representative Powell. Further discussion? Further discussion by any member? Does any member of the committee wish to be heard on the merits of the proposition before the committee? I will point out that our whip is a member of this committee by virtue of his office and is a voting member, and we would be glad to have his vote on this legislation today as well. Sort of like communion in the Methodist Church, we welcome everybody to the table. And we're honored to have you amongst us these days where you can go back and tell the leadership what a really hard-working committee looks like. Further discussion. We have a motion due pass now on LC 18940TS as amended by committee. All in favor of that motion, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, like sign. Carries unanimously. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Mr.
Majority Leader. We are adjourned.